So, welcome everybody to this DPAC public meeting on Zoom and on various different social media platforms. I'm very pleased to be able to chair this meeting. It's a privilege to be part of the DPAC family, and the meeting focusing tonight on the social model of disability. And we're using Ellen Clifford's book, The War on Disabled People, as the starting point, her chapter, which is about thinking about how we need to have a reinvigorated social model of disability and what that might look like. First of all, I need to start with an apology to all of those of you, including me, who pre-ordered a copy of the book. Unfortunately, Z Books was taken over by Bloomsbury, who halved the number of copies printed, and the book sold out, I suspect, because I pre-ordered, before release, let alone after release. A second print run is being rushed through as we speak, and we've been assured an ebook will be available soon, and an audio book has been agreed to. So that will hopefully enable us to have a range of formats that everybody can access. This is extremely ironic, given that a central theme within the book is how society continues to misjudge and misunderstand disability and disabled people. For any questions, please contact the publishers, Z Books, directly. So tonight's meeting is going to be in two parts. We're going to have an access break halfway through, and we should be finished around 8:30 p.m. As long as the speakers keep to their time slots. All the speakers are deaf and disabled activists coming from a diverse range of perspectives. And I want to encourage everybody who's participating in this public meeting to be active, to add your comments and thoughts in the discussion section or the comments section of whichever platform you are watching on. So why is the social model so important? And it's often, this is a very personal thing, but it's a personal and it's a much wider political thing. On a personal level, for me, it was liberating when I actually came to an understanding from another disabled activist that my impairment wasn't the cause of my pain, my discrimination. It was actually the barriers in society. And looking at all the other liberation movements and the liberation struggles, none of them can be effective without a theory and ideas that challenge the dominant and oppressive views and ideology in society. And that's part of our oppression. So to have a theory that locates disability in the world outside of us, outside of our impairments, and that's the cause of our disability, is liberating. And it's not just a theory at an individual level, although that's very powerful, and particularly the whole aspect around internalized oppression, that dominant society operates a medical or an individual model and tells us our whole lives we're not as good as everybody else. To throw that off and to understand disability in relation to structural oppression, the barriers in society, the physical, attitudinal, intellectual, is a great step forward. So the focus for us has to be on understanding the social model and creating that change. So I'm very proud to introduce Ellen Clifford, who's our first speaker, who's a disabled activist on the DPAC National Steering Group and author of The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare, and the Making of a Human Catastrophe, published by Z Books. So over to you, Ellen, to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Mark. So as Mark explained, to start the meeting, I'm going to say a bit about why I think we might need, depending on what you think, a reinvigorated model of disability, and my ideas for what that might look like, as outlined in the final chapter of my book on pages 309 to 322 for anyone who does actually have a paperback copy. There's also a summary of the key points on the DPAC website and a translation of those in British Sign Language. You can get the link also from the DPAC website. And I believe People First is very kindly making an easy read version for us. I firstly want to acknowledge the role of my co-thinker, Mark Dunk, in developing these ideas, which are the product, I'd say, of both our political analysis of the relationship between disability and capitalism, and by our lived experience as disabled people who identify under the social model of disability. Myself being a person who lives with mental distress, and Mark being an autistic person who also lives with a chronic fluctuating health condition. Unfortunately, Mark can't be with us tonight, although he sends solidarity. And that's a particular shame in that I think he explains the idea of impairment as a material deficit, which is explained in the book, far better than I can. I want to also thank all the speakers tonight for taking the time to consider these ideas and to give their views. As I state in the book, a reinvigorated social model can't be created and imposed on the movement by any one person. As repeated to the point of, I think it must have been boredom by Oliver and Barnes, the social model was never intended to be a perfect theory of disability. The whole point of it is as a tool for building a collective identity in order to unite people who face similar barriers as a result of the socio-economic structures we live under, and thus to build a movement capable of winning social change. With this goal in mind, refreshing the social model must be carried out as a collective endeavour, informed by the diverse experiences and perspectives of a range of people who experience disableism and have the same aims in terms of changing society and fighting social injustice. As people will be aware, Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC, follows a social model of disability. This is one of our founding principles on which the campaign was set up. Throughout our activity, we've been conscious of the need to defend and promote the social model in opposition to the development of what is known as the Waddell. I should probably have let the interpreters know this one was coming up in advance. Waddell is Waddell, and Aylward, which is Aylward, biopsychosocial model of disability. This biopsychosocial model is the way of looking at disability that underpins the welfare reform programme used in the UK to cut benefits and to turn the social security system into a punitive and cruel regime of disability denial and discrimination. The biopsychosocial model represents an approach to disability which essentially blames the individual for the barriers that we face, promoting the idea that if we were pushed to try harder, we'd be able to overcome disadvantage and achieve the same in life as non-disabled people. Its development was heavily influenced by approaches used by US insurance companies for turning down disability claims, as detailed in the research of Mo Stewart. The role of the biopsychosocial model in welfare reform is also explained in a seminal article by DPAC's co-founder, the late Debbie Jolly, which is called A Tale of Two Models, and that can be found on the DPAC website. So the appearance of the biopsychosocial model happened at the time when the social model itself was becoming weaker. This was due, on the one hand, to criticisms of the social model by disabled people ourselves, who didn't find it something they could identify under for various reasons, and on the other, to co-option by governments and public bodies, who, while officially signing up to the social model, were at the same time making cuts and deliberately regressing the rights of disabled people, sometimes, in fact, using the social model as a justification for removing support. For example, claiming that people would become more independent, which is in line with promoting the social model of disability, and using that as a justification for cutting independent living support. So this has led newer campaigners coming into political activity to be understandably suspicious of the social model. When I came to write the book, I was aware that groups of, for example, deaf BSL users, autistic campaigners, people with chronic illness, and people living with mental distress were feeling excluded by the social model of disability. I was also aware how far interpretations of the social model handed down within the disabled people's movement had moved away from the vision articulated by Mike Oliver. In particular, I felt there wasn't enough emphasis placed on the fact that the primary use of the social model should be as a tool for collective resistance. I also thought more emphasis should be given to the fact that the social model never sought to deny pain, illness, or distress. Oliver never said those things don't exist and they can't be talked about. The social model of disability is just a completely different thing. The social model is concerned with the shared oppression faced by people with impairments. And within the term people with impairments, we include those who are ill, those who live with pain, those who live with distress. The problem is that not everyone in those groups identifies with the term impairment. And Oliver himself said there was a real need for a social model of impairment to go alongside the social model of disability. But that debate never really got anywhere. And that's something I believe Bob Williams-Finley will be saying more about tonight. These were issues I hoped to include somewhere in the book when I was thinking about how to structure it, because I'd come to the conclusion that we needed a social model of disability that was better suited as a tool for activism in the particular moment of history that we're currently in. I was aware that this would be difficult. It was something Oliver actually argued against putting time and resources into. Disabled campaigners have been too stretched to adequately communicate and educate social model approaches over the past 10 years, and now the conditions and challenges we face are arguably even harder. But I still think it's something worth considering because of the greater unity it could bring and because of its potential to be an even more powerful guide to action. So those were my thoughts going into the process of writing the book. And then I actually had time in my life to sit down and read and think. It wasn't very long, not nearly long enough, but I did. And I actually properly read Oliver and thought about what he was saying for the first time. And I was struck that a medical model of disability was never part of his thinking. Oliver posed a social model of disability in opposition to a core ideology of individualism upon which capitalist society rests. He described an individual model with components that include the medicalisation of disability and are underpinned by personal tragedy theory. In the book, I argue that the focus traditionally placed by the disabled people's movement on opposing the medical model was a product of the particular socio-economic barriers experienced by disabled people in the historical period when the social model was first developed. I do also wonder, though, if Oliver's analysis might have been clearer, his analysis of, core ideology of individualism and then these components. I wonder if that analysis might have been clearer if he'd openly said he was drawing on the ideas of the Italian socialist Antonio Gramsci, who developed an analysis of core and peripheral ideologies as underpinning capitalist society. So I don't know if Oliver hoped by being less open or not explicitly talking about these Marxist influences. I wonder if he was hoping to build greater consensus for his ideas. And that was something I was actually hoping to get the chance to ask him. And that was sadly just before he died last year. So my first point in relation to my ideas for how to reinvigorate the social model of disability. Within that, I think we need to reclaim Oliver's intentions and start to frame the social model as an idea that has collectivity, interdependence, and diversity at its forefront and is in opposition to the ideology of individualism that capitalism promotes. Different disabled people will come up against different components of that individualism as a result of impairment differences, the way people with different impairments are treated differently, or in different periods of time. Examples of those components include medicalisation, but also eugenics, the recovery model of mental health as an example, and illness denial, which people with chronic illness experience. And I think this is a much more inclusive way of understanding the social model that could enable more people to identify under it. And I also think it would make a better tool for focusing disabled people's struggle on the need to achieve fundamental social change. In fact, changing the core ideology on which our society is based. My second point is to suggest that we need a social model of impairment. So as I've mentioned just now, I think we need to emphasise that the social model of disability doesn't deny the existence of illness or of pain or of distress, and not to deny the importance of activity that is focused on dealing with those. For example, the spaces in my life where I engage in peer support with other women who live with mental distress, and in particular, the form of mental distress I experience, which is linked to emotional supersensitivity, those are hugely important spaces in my life. And there's an interaction between those spaces and my campaigning against the oppression of disabled people. So I'm not belittling or completely separating off activity that is focused on our individual well-being. But I do think it's important to recognise that the social model of disability just isn't about that. It wasn't intended to be, and it's not very useful for doing that. Additionally, I think we also need to address the fact that the term impairment doesn't fit for many people who nevertheless experience disabling oppression. We need something that can reflect how our understanding of issues such as mental distress and neurodiversity have developed in a way that realises the positive personal attributes that those entail. Disabling oppression is directed at people who don't fit the standard formulation of what an ideal worker looks like or should look like. We therefore experience material disadvantage despite the positive aspects of our identity. So, for example, a deaf BSL user has their own cultural and linguistic identity, which they can be rightly proud of. But to an employer, they can be seen as a cost burden because they need communication support within the mainstream workplace. The idea of impairment as material rather than biological deficit could be one way to address this. It is quite a complicated one, and I think would need quite a lot of working out, but I think it can be possible, and particularly with reference to the particular socio-economic structures that we live under and the shortcomings of those. Lastly, I think a reinvigorated social model of disability must highlight the importance of activity and the essential role of the social model as a tool for social change. It shouldn't be a subject for, in Oliver's words, intellectual masturbation. We need to ensure a direct living link between disability activism and our ideas about how oppression operates and how it can be challenged. Over the years, the social model has been heavily watered down by charities and disability organisations who pay lip service to it, but who aren't on board with the radical transformation of society that I believe is the logical conclusion of a social model approach. People with those viewpoints may not be on board with a reinvigorated model of disability, social model of disability, but it will enable us to more easily identify who our allies are in the project of achieving the fundamental social and political change that we need to end not just the oppression of disabled people, but the end of all forms of oppression and exploitation. Thank you, and solidarity.
Thank you, Ellen. That gets us off to a great start. I think you framed tonight's discussion brilliantly, and it really opens up the possibilities, not just for understanding the social model and reinvigorating it, but as a theory of social change. And I think that's really important. And so I'm really proud to be able to introduce our next speaker, who has been central to the fight in understanding mental distress, in leading a social movement in the mental health resistance network in that area of disability. So please, can I hand over now to Denise McKenna.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the mental health survivor movement. It's been around for decades, in fact, centuries, and it's kind of unparalleled to the wider disabled people's movement. Now, we often don't think of ourselves as disabled or as having impairments, and these tend not to be words we use, although a lot of people do speak of mental illness. I agree with Ellen that capitalism is at odds with the needs of disabled people, but while we're living with it, the social model is a powerful campaigning tool. But yes, I do believe it needs reconsideration to take account of how the disabled people's movement has expanded to include a wider range of impairments. Now, although survivors were aware of the disabled people's movement, the social model of by the disabled people's movement, and identified with a lot of it, we were working on issues that were specific to us. And we were, in effect, we were developing our own social model. We were focused at that time on the social causes of our impairment, and not so much on our disability. And those social causes were at odds with the medical interventions that were being offered to us by way of treatment. Now, I would stress that much of our discussion was taking place within the psychiatric system. So we were cut off from the wider disabled people's movement and people who live with mental distress who were not basically in secondary care or in the psychiatric system. So when we speak of social inclusion, the barriers are absolutely legion. So at the worst of times, living with mental distress can be so painful that a lot of people choose to end their own lives. When pain reaches a level that's beyond what a person can endure, then social inclusion becomes irrelevant to them, and pain relief is everything. Because we are currently stuck in the medical model and the individual models of mental distress, we are unable to explore alternatives that might bring this pain relief. So in addition to levels of distress, it can also be difficult to see how to include someone in a state of psychosis who's all but removed from society by their own, let's say, mindset. We mustn't assume that being part of society is compulsory, but society must be responsible for enabling everyone to live, even if they're in effect outside of society. This is about human rights, and it's called civilization. So here are two arguments for a social model of impairment. That the causes of mental distress, i.e. the impairment, originates in society and needs to be treated as such. And that would also enable preventative measures to take place. The main one would be the reduction of inequality, but we can't expect that to happen soon. And two, the effects of the impairment are in themselves disabling. This is over and beyond how society disables people in mental distress with things like stigma and huge amounts of misinformation and deception. So in 2010, we linked up with the wider disability movement to campaign against the removal of Social Security. We found that a lot of physically disabled people knew nothing about us, about our language and culture. And as I said, others with mental distress, including physically disabled people with mental distress, were far more familiar with the wider disabled people's movement's social model than the survivor movement one. We have, however, tried to fit in to the disabled people movement's idea of a social model. And as it is, the underlying sentiment is pretty much the same as ours. We didn't have a formal social model, but we talked about one. So Ellen has mentioned that the disabled people's movement's initial focus was on the medical model, as this was on medicalisation or medical interventions, as this was a major source of people's immediate oppression. But since then, the disabled people's movement has been able to move on to identify more specifically an individual model as being the oppressor, and armed with the social model, have been able to go out into the world and make some changes to it. However, the medical model is not historic for us. It's very much alive, and it's enshrined in law in the form of the Mental Health Act. Furthermore, the very existence of the profession of psychiatry ensures that most putative treatments, at least from the NHS, must come from a medical model. The pharmaceutical industry, along with the psychiatric profession, have enormous power over our lives. People are still being restrained and forcibly injected with antipsychotics on psychiatric wards and in the community. They can still be forcibly given ECT. Once you're on these drugs, it's very difficult to come off them. They have powerful side effects, causing all sorts of physical problems, and they are mentally debilitating. They render one practically incapacitated. So we often end up trapped in the system. Now, all of this drug pushing has been happening while we've been protesting that the cause of our distress is not physical, but due to all sorts of societal factors, mainly involving oppression, poverty, abuse, trauma, and so on. For all of these decades, we've really not been listened to. And I've been recently at loads of meetings where NHS campaigners have been talking about saving the NHS, which of course I agree with, but they invariably mention the goal of reinvigorating mental health services. Now, those of us who have been trapped in that system just shudder at that thought. The medical, individual, and social models are all about where we locate the cause of the disability. But for people with mental distress, there was also the need to locate the cause of the impairment, the cause of what has caused us to go mad, basically, which we believe is society. So, and we're now also plagued with the individual model in the form of the recovery model and things like CBT, positive psychology, which of course are in keeping with the individualism of capitalism and the blaming of the individual. However, we've been waylaid for a very, very long time, wrestling with this medical giant. And I'm afraid in this struggle, we've gone backwards. So we need to bring an end to the misinformation and lies that relate to mental distress, things like us being dangerous and so on, and the deception that it is a physical condition when the evidence shows that it's not. And we do need to speak about the end of, the need for some kind of non-medical lifelong support, but I'm afraid we're a very long way from that. And we can conceptualize this as a form of independent living, and that would revolutionize our lives. So to sum up, yes, I would like to see a reinvigorated social model that's more inclusive of mental distress and a social model of impairment that will give us a language to speak of the disabling effects of what we understand as impairment itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. That was brilliant. Our next speaker is Katherine Hale, from the Chronic Illness Project, and I've been fortunate enough to be campaigning alongside Katherine in Parliament on several occasions against the hostile environment in welfare benefits for disabled people, arguing for the scrapping of conditionality and sanctions and for a transformative approach to disability benefits in the system. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Katherine tonight and hand over to you for the next part. Katherine.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I'm going to start off by saying straight out, I completely agree with Ellen that the social model is nothing if it's not a tool for uniting disabled people to take collective action. And our common experiences through COVID-19 have shown how little disabled lives matter to the political classes and how much we need to unite and fight back. So I founded the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project in 2017. It was a programme of action research, and it was aimed at developing an advocacy movement for people with chronic illness. When we looked at our lived experiences as opposed to our collection of diagnostic labels, we found that what unites us is the experience of what we've come to call energy impairment. I don't have time to go into what that means now, but it's very close to what people refer to as spoon theory or being a spoonie. I think a lot of people have come across that. We also found that the main form of our oppression that we experience as a community takes the form of invalidation and disbelief of that very debilitating impairment experience. The idea that we're just tired or there's nothing really wrong with us is at the root of a lot of our trauma, the injustice, the exclusion and the neglect we experience as a community. Now, potentially, the community of people with energy limiting chronic illnesses is quite a big constituency of disabled people. According to government statistics, 32% of working age disabled people in the UK experience impairment of stamina, breathing, or fatigue. But in many ways, we're quite disconnected as a community from the disabled people's movement. Many people with energy limiting chronic illness don't identify as disabled. And that's not just because they reject the negative connotations of the term. It's because we often experience hostility and violence when identifying or positioning ourselves as disabled. And we've internalized the message that we're not genuinely disabled or entitled to use the label, that because we're just tired, or perhaps we're lazy, or that our belief system is all wrong, is what's wrong with us. We're met with this response by benefit assessors within the DWP, by strangers on the street if we use blue badge parking, sometimes from our nearest and dearest, and most especially from the medical profession when they're not able to explain our diseases. It's really encapsulated in what Ellen talked about in terms of the biopsychosocial model of disability. The other problem is the perception within our community that the social model isn't relevant to chronic illness. For people with severe energy impairment, no amount of changing the external stuff, whether it's prejudicial attitudes, inaccessible environments, assistive technologies, none of it makes enough of a difference for us to be able to leave our homes or even our beds if our conditions are severe. And that reality is often felt like it's too difficult for the disabled people's movement to acknowledge. And those of us in these situations have felt left behind, therefore, by the movement. More generally, though, the problem many people have with the social model is with the semantics or the language of it, rather than the underlying principles. I'm talking especially about the distinction between impairment and disability. In our research, we explored this distinction in depth with participants, and people found it really helpful as a tool to help them thinking. Everyone agreed that if society responded differently to chronic illness, our lives would be much better, regardless of whether we had treatment for them or not. And the benefit system and the healthcare system were identified particularly as the immediate source of our oppression and structural injustice. Most participants would agree with Ellen's argument that it's capitalism that disables us because our lives are only valued if they're economically productive. But what people did take issue with was the language of impairment, was disability versus impairment. The slogan, "I'm disabled by society, not by my body," is particularly jarring for people with chronic illness, because of course what the movement means by this is not to deny that illness causes suffering and restriction, but this belongs to the category of impairment, not disability. However, for many people with chronic illness, saying that we're disabled in the everyday use of the word is part of our journey of empowerment, as in we say, "I'm disabled," not lazy or faking or hysterical. So then to be told that our bodies don't disable us and that we're not allowed to use the language in this way feels to a lot of people like the same kind of denial and dismissal and invalidation that we experience on a daily basis. So I'll finish with how do I think we can reinvigorate the social model to overcome that disconnect with the chronic illness community? Firstly, it would help if our experiences of impairment and our language of self-identity is acknowledged and validated by the movement. Then I think we need our experiences of oppression to be included in the movement's understanding of what disability and disablement and disableism look like. So negative attitudes towards disabled people obviously include ideas of tragedy, pity, and othering. They're also about accusations of faking and cheating, and the microaggressions of disbelief towards people with invisible impairments. We believe that these two are two sides of the same coin. Lastly, I think we want our political struggles to be acknowledged and supported by the disabled people's movement. I'm talking particularly about the politics of diagnosis. How and whether diseases are labelled and diagnosed is a fiercely fought battle between patients and the medical establishment. Medicine and psychiatry assume absolute power to validate or discredit not just our symptoms, but our entire selves. It's not an exaggeration to say that these can be matters of life and death. So I agree with Ellen that the medical versus social model binary is problematic. As Ellen has said in her book, without a diagnosis, you have no entitlement to support from social security or social care, and you have no rights as a disabled person. The gaslighting and the trauma that go with the process of trying to get a diagnosis are very real and very damaging. So I think that the talking about an individual as opposed to a medical model of disability is an important way forward. Lastly, if we're going to unite to fight the war on disabled people, we need the movement to include our experiences of both impairment and disability. I'm really excited and encouraged that Deepak's leading the way in doing this work, and I really hope that today leads to further dialogue. And thank you so much for including me in this space. Thank you, Mark. You're muted.
So, sorry. Thank you, Katherine. That was a really excellent start to the discussion. And I think, you know, what we've already started to do just in the two speakers so far is reinvigorate the social model. I'm very pleased now to introduce Karina Marchant, who is a deaf activist. She was formerly the Labour prospective parliamentary candidate for Basingstoke and is a filmmaker. So I've admired Karina's work from afar and on Facebook and Twitter. So I'm really pleased to see you in person and look forward to hearing from you. Karina.
Yeah.
So I am a deaf woman and I'm going to be presenting in BSL, which is my language. But if you ask me, am I disabled? That's a big question. Do I have a place within the social model of disability? Am I included? Got me thinking. Because recently, on Twitter and Facebook, I came under some criticism by a lot of deaf and disabled people because I'd said that deaf and disabled people are not vulnerable and that we shouldn't see ourselves as vulnerable. And that is because the government and capitalism want us to feel vulnerable. They want us to turn to charities to ask for help. They want us to see ourselves as less and have less favourable treatment. So they force us to ask doctors to help us. And that means that we're too busy doing that we don't see the barrier that the government and capitalism have erected help. And it's those that face those barriers before us. And it's the government and capitalism that are eroding our rights. So how do we get rid of those barriers? What do we need? We need the social model of disability. They are afraid of that because they know that through that we can reclaim our rights. If I think about my own experience and my own journey towards deafhood. Now, what is deafhood? Deafhood was first conceptualized by Paddy Ladd and stated that a deaf person will go on their own journey to realize their own identity and pride in being deaf. That they don't have an impairment. And I feel that I don't have an impairment because the fact that I can't hear doesn't matter to me because I have my own language. If I don't speak as well as others, that doesn't matter to me. I'm proud of my language and my culture, and that is deafhood. And for the disabled movement that involves pride, I feel that the social model of disability allows for that pride. So when my son was born, I was told that because he was deaf, a doctor came and told me that, well, first he apologized and said, well, because he's deaf, he's going to have a cochlear implant because that'll mean that he can hear. And when I said, well, why? And the doctor explained to me as if I was not understanding. Well, if he can hear, then he can speak. He can learn to speak. And I said, well, what for? And again, he explained to me, oh, well, then when he grows up, he'll be able to get a job and earn some money. And that's when the penny dropped. And I realized that my baby boy was already being oppressed by the government and being oppressed by capitalism and being forced into a system where his worth was based on what he could earn and what work he could do. And at that point, I realized that that was awful. It's the same with my mother. The Labour MP, Tony Benn, said, "We fight the same battles again and again and again." And I feel that is never more true. Within my experience, I have fought the same battles. The deaf, we fought for the DDA, we fought for our BSL language, and we fought against the government cuts. And now we're fighting against COVID-19, which is disproportionately impacting disabled people. So I've developed my deafhood, and I feel that my deafhood includes my identity as a deaf person. So the social model of disability does have a barrier for me in accessing that movement, because a lot of the activism takes place in spoken English, and it is difficult for me to communicate. But I feel if that barrier was removed, that barrier of language, then it would make it so much easier for deaf people to be able to join that movement and move forward, supporting the aims. And we have to, because our own fight is autism. And now, what is autism? Autism means that we are discriminated against because we're deaf. Doctors tell us that we need to speak, we need to have invasive surgery to be able to hear. Teachers of the deaf force children with speech therapy, trying to judge them. And we're expected to grow up to be able to match the theoretical framework of what is expected to survive in a capitalist society. Why should we change our bodies for that? Why do we need to speak and listen and hear? And I feel like that is why we need the social model of disability for the deaf community. So if we could just get rid of that language barrier, then the deaf community could blend our campaigns, and we could march together and move forward as one singular movement to remove those barriers. And that is part of my journey towards deafhood. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Karina. That was very thought-provoking. I particularly like your challenge to the government on labelling us all as vulnerable and vulnerability, which of course robs us of our voice and our agency. And when I worked for a DDPO in Equal Lives, my deaf colleagues and were particularly discriminated against by Access to Work, who took away their signers, you know, in a disgraceful act of discrimination that was just based on austerity cuts. So I think that's a really valuable and thought-provoking contribution to tonight's proceedings. I'd now like to hand over to Chris Pike, who's an autistic activist and a program manager for the Media Trust. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I just want to first echo that a lot of my comments will repeat somewhat what other people have said, which is a good sign, and that I really agree with the points that Ellen has made in her book about the importance of the social model. And I think for me, the key thing that the social model gives us as a community of disabled people is that sense of solidarity and that sense of community. And one thing which I will be facetious in making the bold claim that I think one thing all disabled people have experienced at some point in their lives is that sense of isolation and feeling separate and feeling isolated. And the social model is one thing that can help to challenge that. But I also agree with many of the speakers that we need a reinvigorated social model. And that's not necessarily to say that the points I'm making are things which the initial social model didn't consider, but they're things that we need to put really at the core of the way we think about the social model. The first one, I think, which has been quite heavily reflected, I think, is that the social model is a communitarian model. It's not an individual model. So I think a lot of the time it's framed as the medical model says, you, the disabled person, has to adapt to me, whereas the social model says, I, the non-disabled person, has to adapt to you, the disabled person. And I think that's completely wrong. What the social model says is that we as a society, both those in power and society more generally as the group of all of us, adapt to each other. And we learn from each other's lived experience, and we apply that to make a world which is accessible and inclusive of all of us. And I think that's a really important part of the social model. Similarly to that, I think it's really important that the social model is not simply a case. One thing that the social model is really valuable for is taking us away from a situation in which we say that disabled people are vulnerable, pitiable, in need of help, and into a situation in which we give disabled people the opportunities and the empowerment that we deserve. And again, you know, we've spoken a lot about the impact of benefit cuts on the disabled community in the UK, and that's, you know, it's absolutely abhorrent. And you know, I know that that's how DPAC was founded in the first place, and it is an absolutely outrageous and horrifying situation. But what we also see in some other countries is a situation where disabled people do receive the money they need to live in the form of benefits and social security, but they're very much, the idea is very much that they take their money and then they stay isolated, separate from society, not included. Not able to work if they want to work, not able to participate in day-to-day activities, not able to go and make friends, not receiving any of the support that they need, and generally being excluded by society, which, although obviously better than the system we currently have where people are frankly being killed, it's still not the system we want, and the social model helps us to move away from that. There's two other really important things that I think are really important in the social model, which I think are often misunderstood, is that the social model is often sort of, I think, lumped in with some of the other liberation movements. And I think it's important to remember that I think some people might consider that the social model is about pride and is about feeling proud to be a disabled person, and sort of, you know, have comparisons between that and the LGBT pride movement. Now, I'm somebody who is proud to be disabled, but I don't think that that is an important part at all of the social model. And as Ellen's reflected, it is the social model of disability exists not to give us all sort of an individual pride or an individual joy in our disability or our impairment, but it's actually to bring us together as a community to fight for our rights and for our liberation. It's not about being proud to be disabled. There are days when I'm proud to be disabled. There are days when I'm absolutely sick of being disabled because of the way that society treats us. But the social model is not about, it's not a party. It's not about sort of celebrating ourselves, although that is obviously part of the movement that I want to see, but that's not what the social model is reflecting. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about is, it's been spoken about how we need to get rid of the sort of dichotomy between the social and medical model, and I think that's important as well, in that, so as you know, I'm as an autistic activist, and the autistic movement has spent a lot of time challenging the idea that autism is something to be cured, which now most people do disagree with, and most people would challenge that idea. But there was a time at which that was the unifying consensus among autism charities, among parents of autistic people, was that autism is a deficit to be cured, and we've moved away from that largely now, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there are situations in which the development of medicines to support people, or medical treatments to support people, can be extremely helpful. For example, with autistic people, a huge significantly higher proportion of the autistic population struggle to sleep, And obviously that can be extremely debilitating. So the development of medication and therapy and support, which helps people to resolve that problem, can be extremely helpful to people. But the social model doesn't question that. And actually, I think the social model is really key for questioning why is it that some areas of medicine develop faster than others, and why are resources invested in particular areas and less in others. And I think, although I wouldn't want to speak for the chronic pain community as I'm not part of that community, but it's something in which we do see that the development of medical understanding of many chronic conditions is extremely far behind. And the social model makes us question, why is that? Why is this not being prioritized, and why is this not being given resource to? So I think those are my sort of 4 key areas that I think we need to be thinking about more when it comes to the social model. But to reiterate that the social model is extremely important, and although we can debate about linguistics and about semantics, and that is all extremely important, but fundamentally the social model is about coming together as a community, recognizing that we are not the problem, and that we need to fight for our liberation is at the core of what the model is about. And I'm fully in support of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think my big takeaway from that is it's really important that the autism movement is led by people with autism, not by charities who speak for us, but led by us. Our final speaker in the first half of tonight's meeting is Bob Williams-Finley, and I'm very proud to work alongside Bob in the Reclaiming Our Futures Alliance struggle to get a national independent living support system, and we're working to try and make that vision that ROFA has a reality. The other thing I think it's really important to say is that in terms of disability publishing and disability books, they're a bit like London buses, and we're very privileged, I think, and lucky that 2 buses have come along in the same month. So in the same month that Ellen has released her book, Bob, and I'm going to do a shameless plug, Bob's released his book this month that I urge everybody to go out and buy as well. So we're going to move the break back because we're running over time slightly. So the break will now take place as soon as Bob has finished, and will last for a quarter of an hour. And then I'm going to hand over to Sarah Hatch to chair the second half of tonight's proceedings. So over to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you for having me. I want to raise some critical points. First of all, I think Ellen's final chapter in her introduction gives a fair reflection of where things stand in the context in which we find ourselves. What we got to remember is that Mike Oliver developed his model out of his thinking of the union of the physically impaired against segregation. And they use the method of looking at history as a political thing. And therefore, when we talk about disability, we got to realise that it has different meanings in different points in history and doesn't always mean the same thing. Therefore, when the social model was developed, what it meant was that disability was seen as a social situation, not a personal characteristic. And that social situation was created by encountered social restrictions. I personally prefer talking about social restrictions rather than disabling barriers. My argument is that to me, it has a deeper meaning. So that if you've got, for instance, a chronic sick impairment or illness, then the social restriction might not be the outside world, but the way in which that world looks at you and judges you and treats you because of your impairment or illness. Then we also need to recognise the term disablement, because that links to the idea of capitalism and refers to the economic and social processes that ultimately create both impairment and disability. I also agree with Helen that there is a need for a new social model of impairment, but whether we all see that as the same thing is a debatable issue. Oliver, when he developed the social model, made 3 general points. One is an attempt to switch the focus away from the functional limitation of the individual to the way disabling environment, various cultures and systems operate. It refuses to see specific problem in isolation from the totality of the society in which we live. And my endorsement of the social model does not mean that individually based interventions in the life of disabled people, whether they are medically, educational or employment based, are of no use or always counterproductive, because the social model isn't about our individual life, but the way which groups of disabled people are impacted on by the way society is economically and socially organised. Therefore, it provided a radical challenge to the medicalisation of bodies and minds, and that was done to regulate us, both within society and the workplace. It challenged blaming the individual for their social disadvantage. And I believe this is one of the fundamental problems with how the social model developed by Oliver have been understood and misunderstood. When he says we are disabled by society, what we were saying was not that the impairment hadn't evolved, but not the direct cause of your social disadvantage, not the personal restrictions, that's something completely different. So it offers a completely different view of the world, and it offers a workable framework for thinking through how to address the material barriers or social restrictions faced by disabled people. It reconfigured the understanding of disablement that operate at both what I call the macro, that is the system and structures, and the micro level, which is the day-to-day world we live in. I also want to make the point that the social model, in my opinion, has two important elements. One is that it's about what kind of society we live in and identifying how it imposes restrictions on us. And secondly, it's a method of thinking through how we deal with those restrictions, those structures, and transform them. Therefore, and this is where I get a little bit contentious, we can't reinvigorate the social model. What we can do is we create a new one. That we're looking at a new set of circumstances, but still using the methods that we have within the social model. Why do I say this? Well, the social model explores disablement and disablism within a social democratic phase of capitalism, which favours a welfare state and state intervention. However, that consensus existed immediately after the settlement war and given way to a new phase that Ellen captured in her book that leave both workers and others further behind and reshapes the class structure. Also, post-COVID-19 and the ecological crisis add to the changing landscape of disablement, which needs analysing and then challenging. So the social model method is still valid, but the nature of the social relationship between disabled people, the state and society have changed. So consideration should be given to developing a radical social ecological model which retain the features of the existing model, but offer a more contextual framework for working within social struggle. There is a need for a social model of impairment that will look at how and why impairment are created and who benefit from that. But not enough to develop the model of disability or impairment, we must combine this with what I call disability practices, which means having a circuit process. We develop a theory, we reflect on what that means, we put into action, and then we reflect on how well we use it, and that helps us model how we see things. So what we need to do is recognize we want to develop more models. We want to develop a theory that sees disability as oppression, not just discrimination. It's far more deeper than that. I think the person that talked about chronic illness was right. If we limit our understanding to discrimination, then we don't understand the bigger picture of how we are oppressed. And we can't assert the value of living disabled moment of life. And that is why when we look at impairment, we've got to be what I call a bit ambivalent. We want to address how impairment are a necessary product of society, while at the same time valuing the life of disabled people.
Thanks, Bob. Could you wrap up now, please? Because we're running behind time.
So basically, what I'm saying is we need to look at how we understood disability today, and then try to understand why impairment and disability are not one and the same issue.
Great. Thank you, Bob. So that concludes the first half of our meeting about reinvigorating the social model. And I'm sure everybody participating will agree that we feel reinvigorated through having this discussion with disabled colleagues. We're now going to break for 10 minutes until 7:50. And I would like to thank the signers and the interpreters for all their work. That's been a really brilliant session. And as I said, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to chair the second half of the meeting. So thank you very much. See you all in 10 minutes time.